Thank you, Mark. It's always good to be here at this beautiful old historic building. And I want to thank Bill Gatewood and Georgia Ann and Daniel and all the staff here at the old State House. And of course, to thank Mark Christ, who does a good job of putting these things together time after time. And believe me, that's not easy for the reasons, some of the reasons he just talked about. And then I want to thank, also want to thank the Arkansas Humanities Council, who, as far as I know, had absolutely nothing to do with this presentation. But I promised Paul Austin I would give them a shout out, so done. And finally to Ken Barnes, who graciously agreed to give me 15 minutes of his time because my program was going to run a little long. Thank you, Ken. I don't know which is worse, that those of you out in the audience have buttons that say confused, or that those of us up here have buttons that say confusing. That may be even worse. But what I'm about to talk about is both confused and confusing. The Brooks-Baxter War is one of the most unique events, not only in Arkansas history, but in the history of the United States, in my opinion. And there are several principal figures that I want to talk about, but I want to lay a little background, and Jay talked about this a little, so I won't go back over what he talked about. But as early as the late 1860s, after the war, there had begun to be a schism within the dominant Republican Party in Arkansas between a regular wing led by Governor and then Senator Powell Clayton and an insurgent wing, or liberal Republicans. And this division was at least in part driven by the fact that Reconstruction in Arkansas was largely controlled by that group we would call outside Unionists, people who had not been in Arkansas prior to the war, people that Southerners at the time called carpetbaggers. And there was a great deal of resentment by that group of native Arkansans, or Arkansans who had been here before the Civil War, who felt they had never been adequately represented. That group that Southern conservatives call scalawags. And that's part of the story, but it's only a part. And it's, again, is true of just about everything in this area. It's not the whole story at all. The liberal Republican Party, the insurgent wing, included people like Senator Benjamin Rice, but the man who came to lead it was, well, the guy you got to start with is this guy, right? You can't talk about the Civil War in Arkansas, Reconstruction in Arkansas, without talking about Powell Clayton. But in 1871, Powell Clayton, who was the governor, had seen the handwriting on the wall, realizing that when the former disfranchised Democrats got the vote back, that the Republican Party's days might well be numbered. And so in January of 1871, he got the state legislature to elect him to the U.S. Senate. And got him a position that was a little more secure. And of course, he'll remain an active player in Republican politics statewide and nationally well into the 20th century. But the man who comes to lead the liberal or insurgent wing of the Republican Party is this guy, Joseph Brooks. Born in Cincinnati in 1821, became an ordained Methodist preacher at age 18, was a circuit rider in Virginia, Iowa, and Indiana. 1856, he settled in St. Louis, became the editor of the Central Christian Advocate, a Methodist anti-slavery paper which gave him a forum for his own strong abolitionist views. Brooks comes to Arkansas in 1863 as a chaplain of a black Union regiment whose colonel was his brother, William Brooks. William Brooks was killed in the Battle of Helena in July 1863. And after the war, Joseph Brooks remained in Phillips County and made a considerable sum of money in the cotton business. He became a member of the Republican Party and was a dominant figure at the Constitutional Convention of 1868, where he was the strongest advocate for full civil rights for African Americans. Brooks is also famous because he was involved in an event that was the assassination of a sitting member of Congress in Arkansas. Congressman James Hines was assassinated, shot from ambush. Brooks was with him, and he was wounded but survived that assassination. He had supported Governor Clayton's employment of the militia, but had fallen out with the governor and became leader of the reform or liberal wing of the party. He was a powerful speaker, leading another liberal Republican, a noted African-American orator here in Little Rock, to declare that Brooks' voice reminded him of an old Brindletail bull that he used to see as a boy that bellowed so loud that it scared the other cattle half to death. And hence, Brooks' faction would come to be called the Brindletails. In 1871, Brooks announced his intention to seek the governorship the following year. And in May of 1872, the Liberal Republican Convention meeting in Little Rock made him its nominee. The convention that nominated Brooks was biracial in nature. The accounts say it was about half black and half white. And Brooks opened his campaign in June of 72 with a speech right out here on the yard of the State House. What's interesting about this thing is that so much of it takes place right here where we are today. In that speech, he castigated Clayton and his administration in the strongest possible language, promising that if elected, he would launch an investigation into their various crimes, and added that he could find juries to present indictments and attorneys to prosecute. Quote, "I will fill the penitentiary so full of them that their legs and arms will be sticking out the doors and windows." 4 days later, Clayton went to a Brooks rally at Lewisburg in Conway County, where Brooks repeated pretty much the same speech. Clayton sat in the audience listening intently, and then he was asked to speak. And Clayton responded with a biting speech that matched or exceeded that given by Brooks, calling the liberal leaders, quote, "as scurvy a set of knaves and thieves as ever plunged their hands into the public treasury and eluded the walls of the penitentiary." Clayton charged them with being participants in the very corruption they professed to deplore. He personally singled out Brooks, James Hodges, and Benjamin Rice as, quote, "thieves and scoundrels reeking with corruption." He charged, quote, "they have stolen not only $500,000 from the Cairo and Fulton Railroad Company, but nearly everything else in the state." And turning to Brooks and looking directly at him, he concluded his remarks with a fable. "There was once an old brindle bull which had been driving the small game into the lion's mouth by bellowing up and down, and in turn the lion permitted him to graze a little unmolested. But we shall not let the old brindle play his game any longer. In November, we will strip his hide off and hang it up for a warning." Well, despite that prediction, Clayton understood that Brooks was a formidable candidate, and stripping his hide off would not be an easy thing to do. His strong record on civil rights gave Brooks support from African Americans in Arkansas, and his platform of universal suffrage, universal amnesty, and honest men in office, combined with his opposition to Clayton, gave him a strong appeal to many conservative Democrats. In the end, that support, however, would cost him dearly among his own party. So, confronted by a candidate with wide appeal and great political skills, the regular, that is, the pro-Clayton Republicans, faced the greatest challenge in their brief political history. Meeting convention in August of 72, they discarded the rather colorless lieutenant governor and nominated Batesville merchant Elisha Baxter. Now, Baxter, as I said, was considered a scalawag, but like Brooks, he was not a native Arkansan. He was a native of North Carolina, but he had come to Batesville in 1852, served 2 terms in the state legislature, and the records say that he was a one-time Whig who had supported Thomas Heinemann in 1858 and 1860, but had opposed secession. That's a real strange political background. It's like saying you're for breathing, but you don't believe in air, because Heinemann was a rabid secessionist. Baxter's wartime experiences were the stuff of adventure tales. When federal forces occupied Batesville in 1862, he was offered commission in the Union Army, but he declined. When Confederate forces reoccupied Batesville, he fled to Missouri, where he took a job as a school teacher. In 1863, he was captured by a Confederate raiding party led by Colonel Robert C. Newton and returned to Arkansas to stand trial for treason in Little Rock. Friends here in Little Rock helped him escape. Apparently, a fellow inmate's wife smuggled in a key. kind of friends you need to have, by the way, if you get in prison. And he began a long and dangerous flight to Union lines in Missouri, surviving on little more than corn and berries. He now, thoroughly ticked off, decided he would take that commission. And he recruits a mounted infantry regiment and becomes its colonel. After Little Rock falls to Union forces, Baxter came back to Little Rock, later elected by a Unionist legislature to the U.S. Senate, but the Senate refused to seat him. A prominent member of the regular Republicans, John G. Price, had one time been a member of a minstrel troupe, a very famous, very popular form of entertainment in the 19th century. And so the regulars soon came to be called the Minstrels. So you have the Brindletails, the liberal faction, and the Minstrels. The platform, Jay alluded to this earlier, the platforms were not substantially different. This is about which side you came from, and it's a matter of personalities. Like the convention that nominated Brooks, the convention that nominated Baxter was about half white and half black in composition. And that racial division was reflected in the state's newspapers. Thomas Staples, who Jay referred to earlier, noted that of the newspapers in the state, 12 Republican and 9 Democratic papers supported Brooks, while 3 Republican and 14 Democratic papers supported Baxter. It gets worse. So these two men are going to square off in the gubernatorial election of 1872. And Michael Dugan, in his book Arkansas Odyssey, said this, that Carpetbagger Brooks ran with Democratic and Scalawag support against a scalawag nominated by a party composed almost exclusively of carpetbaggers. Was enough to confound and bewilder most voters as well as the modern student. Not only were Brooks and Baxter members of the same political party, technically, they were both good Methodists. Brooks was a Methodist preacher, and Baxter was active, very active in the Methodist church in Batesville. Baxter could not match Brooks's oratorical ability, but he had an ace of his own. He and his side of the Republican Party had control of the election machinery, and that would prove critical. The election of 1872, November 72, was marred by the now all too familiar pattern of fraud, intimidation, and stuffed ballot boxes. Returns from 4 counties were declared invalid and thrown out. In Lincoln County, Perry County, Van Buren, and Arkansas counties, a number of votes were disqualified, so that the official results from those counties gave Baxter 465 votes and Brooks 0. They loved them some Elisha Baxter in those 4 counties. Now that's what you call a mandate, 465 to nothing. But in Jefferson County, some 400 Baxter votes were disqualified. And so, who would have won a fair election? Who knows? Brooks supporters claimed that let me show you the results. These were the official returns. Remembering now that Baxter's side has control of the election machinery for the most part. Baxter wins by 41,681 to 38,415. And the regular Republican Party retained control of the legislature. Brooks supporters claim the actual totals were Baxter 42,394, Brooks 43,992. In other words, they claimed they had actually won by 1,500 votes. But of course, when they went to the legislature to try to make that point, the legislature was not interested. They were on Baxter's side. And so, thus frustrated in the legislature, Brooks' forces turned to the courts. 1873, you have a series of events. In March, an amendment put to the voters restoring the right to vote to former Confederates passed, and that passes overwhelmingly. Both these guys had reached out, if we're elected, we're going to end this disfranchisement. as Jay pointed out, Arkansas was the last state to do this. June, the Attorney General issues a quo warranto proceeding against Baxter. Any lawyers in the group? Good. My understanding is quo warranto means you got to prove the case, prove that you are actually entitled to the office. Okay? Anybody know any different? Yeah. Okay, we'll go. The state Supreme Court denied the writ, so Brooks filed a complaint against Baxter in the Pulaski County Circuit Court. But nothing comes of it for a while. Now, in November of that year, there's a special election. Because of people retiring and taking other jobs in government, there's a number of open seats. And in that election in November, Democrats reassert themselves as a powerful force in the state legislature. Now, in his inaugural address, Baxter had promised to restore the vote to everyone who had been disfranchised. Quoting here, "The disfranchisement of certain classes for participation in the rebellion is a great impediment in the way of restoring fraternal feelings among the people. It's needless to say that I desire the immediate enfranchisement of all those persons who are now denied a voice." And he moved quickly to make good on that pledge. He voted, the March Amendment passes. Baxter appointed regulars and liberal Republicans and even some Democrats to government positions. And it seemed for a time that all was going well. The Daily Republican reported in late 1873 that there had not been such peace and contentment in Arkansas since the beginning of Reconstruction. And Thomas Staples notes in his book, Brooks was deserted by all but a few disgruntled Republican leaders, and his Reform Party was all but dead. But in broadening his appeal to his opponents, Baxter had weakened himself with his own base. In the following year, a major schism develops. The Democrats who had prospered in the special election now propose creating a new constitution. You know, we hadn't had a new constitution since 1868. But they want to go, and Baxter went along with that. Now this begins to alarm these two men, Senator Stephen Dorsey on the right, former governor, and now Senator Powell Clayton on the left, who had always supported Baxter. He's their guy. Baxter further alienated his supporters by announcing that he would not issue any more railroad bonds. And this really upset Dorsey and Clayton because they both had investments in railroad building in Arkansas. He said he believed the bonds issued by the Reconstruction governments, apparently including $400,000 worth that he had issued, had been issued in violation of the Constitution, and indicated he would not issue any more such bonds. Well, now he really had Clayton and Dorsey's attention, because not only were they personally invested, but they considered railroad building the key to their whole economic plan for Reconstruction. And so this was the last straw. Clayton and Dorsey deserted Baxter and went over to Brooks. And they persuaded the circuit judge in Pulaski County to bring back up the case of Brooks versus Baxter, which had been filed 10 months previously. And on April 15, 1874, the judge voided Baxter's claim that they had no cause for action, voided that claim, and declared Brooks the legal governor of Arkansas. Brooks was sworn in by Chief Justice John McClure, who had himself been a Clayton supporter and now is a Brooks supporter. And shortly thereafter, Brooks and over a dozen armed men marched to the State House. There we are. And forced the startled Baxter to vacate the governor's office. Now, one Arkansas historian said that the timid Baxter left the office. And I was like, what was he supposed to do? Timid? You got some armed men here saying you're going to leave or we're going to arrest you or worse. I'd have left too, and he did. But he didn't go far. This action on April 15, 1874, initiates the so-called Brooks-Baxter War. And again, much of it takes place. Brooks and his supporters have now occupied the State House. They've begun to build earthworks and fortifications around the grounds. They have taken down the doors, according to one account, on both sides and placed cannon in the doorways. Yes, this was probably the exterior door. Is that right, Dan? Yeah. Was it Daniel? Was this the exterior door? This has been the back of the.
No, it's the other side of the restroom.
Oh, that door. Anyway, cannon on both sides. Now, people sometimes ask, I digress, what are you proud of in your life? I'm proud of this slide. If those smart aleck young historians at Arkansas Tech could see this slide that I made, with a little help from my wife yesterday, they would be impressed. So here, this is called a bird's eye view of the Capitol. That's the slide, but I made this, let's be clear, I made the arrows, I made the text boxes, okay? Oh, can I not move away? So there's the State House in a red arrow. Baxter's forces take up residence in the Anthony House, a hotel here at Markham and Scott, and you're looking southwest away from the river. And federal troops occupied the area around Main Street to keep the two forces apart. Huh? Oh, well, got lost. There. Great slide. Baxter had mobilized a militia before all this started, and he put in command Robert C. Newton. And that was ironic because the same guy that had arrested him in Missouri in the Civil War and brought him back to Little Rock for trial. Can you make this stuff up? He's now in charge of Baxter's militia. Brooks' militia was headed by James Fagan, another Confederate officer, and a Union officer named Robert Catterson. So both these guys have former Confederate officers heading their militias. And there is one. This is or was on. Is it still there on the grounds of the Lonoke County Courthouse? Do you know? This cannon, they think, was used in the Brooks-Baxter War. If you go to the Lonoke County Courthouse, you'll see that cannon. So both sides now are trying to draw supporters in, and they need guns. So in late April, Brooks sent an aide to St. Louis to purchase arms and ammunition for his troops. The agent purchased about 2,000 rifles, 13,000 rounds of ammunition, and a large quantity of other supplies, and had them shipped to Little Rock in boxes labeled whiskey or Arkansas State Reports. So if somebody came over and said, what is it? Well, that's just whiskey and it's state reports. Baxter's forces likewise fortified their position near the Anthony House, bringing in several small artillery pieces and this large 64-pound cannon that had been positioned along the riverbank during the Civil War. This gun has quite a history. It had been aboard the Confederate gunboat Pontchartrain, which Mark tells me is right over there on the bank, the Main Street Bridge, on the bank of the Main Street Bridge. It had also been at Fort Heineman in an attack on Arkansas Post. It's then brought to Little Rock during the Civil War. When the Confederates leave, they leave it out there, supposedly spiked it, and leave it along the bank. And the Baxter people rescue it and set it up at the Anthony House. And the accounts I read, Mark, and you can probably comment on this, if they had shot that thing at the State House, they might have demolished the State House. It was a big gun. And of course, you can see it right out here on the lawn as you leave. And of course, it was quickly nicknamed Lady Baxter. And though the controversy affected the whole state, Little Rock remained the center. Volunteers for both sides rushed to the city until the number of armed men reached about 3,000, with each faction seeking desperately to secure weapons and ammunition. Among the Baxter supporters arriving in the city were about 300 black troops from Pine Bluff. They were led by a white officer who quickly established a reputation as one of the most colorful characters of the Reconstruction era, Hercules King Cannon White. whom John Harrell, the 19th century historian, called the most conspicuous figure next to Brooks and Baxter who took part in the Brooks-Baxter War. Now, some of you may have heard me say this before, but if your name is Hercules King Cannon White, you damn well better be colorful. Okay? And he was. Kentucky native who had left home at age 15 to fight for the Confederate Army, fought both as a regular and a guerrilla, moved to Pine Bluff to live with relatives after the war, gets his law license. Harold described him as follows. He was about 28 years of age in 1874, raw-boned, red-haired, freckled. He married in Pine Bluff to the granddaughter of ex-governor John Selden Rome and allied himself with Clayton. He entered into the organization of the Republican Party with apparent zest, and in his county, the large majority of whom were Negroes, and acquired an ascendancy over people of that race in Arkansas. Harold went on to say that White was, quote, a man of unusual strength of intellect and originality, full of resources, energy, and audacity, and so frank and fearless in his manner with men that he controls them by sheer force of will and dash. For all that colorfulness, images of Hercules, King, Cannon, White are very, very difficult to find. Now, this is where someone like me, a professional historian, has an advantage over the general population, because you can do research and you can find things that quite frankly, some of you would never find. And I think I have uncovered a unique and never before seen picture of Hercules, King, Cannon, White. I think this was him. Now, some of you are a little skeptical, I can tell. But you Google Hercules, King, Cannon, White and see what you find. This is what you find. Actually, I did find this much less than dramatic picture from the Jefferson County Historical Quarterly. And this is White at about 1882, so he's a much older man. He is a character of the First Order. When the controversy broke out, White tendered his services to Baxter, raised 3 companies of black troops at Pine Bluff, steamed up with them to Little Rock. 2 days later, 500 more black men arrived by the steamboat from Pine Bluff to reinforce Baxter at the Anthony House. And that same day, a large contingent of white citizens arrived from Pope and Johnson counties to lend their support to the governor, the exile governor. About 5 p.m., White turned out he had a band. He had a band made up of black musicians. He turned his command, accompanied by a brass band, for a parade around the Anthony House, ending with the Anthony House, where they called for Baxter to come out and speak on the balcony. And Baxter was supposed to be ill, but he comes out there and addressed his supporters and urges, to his credit, Baxter urged patience. We don't want bloodshed. And then White rode his horse up to the balcony and said to Baxter, "I am not here, sir, to make a speech." And then he proceeded to make a speech, the highlight of which was he said this to Baxter: "Furnish us simply with the means, give us the authority, pronounce the order, and I will guarantee to you, sir, that in 25 minutes from the time the order is written, Joseph Brooks will either be in hell or in the archives." It was a bold pledge, particularly in light of the fact that many of White's soldiers were unarmed. Again, to his credit, Baxter urged patience, and he implored White, "Why don't you go back to Pine Bluff with your guys? I'll call you when I need you." But as they were attempting to do that, a federal officer who was keeping the peace on Main Street rode into the crowd trying to get to Baxter to calm things down, apparently bumped into one of King White's musicians. And one of his armed soldiers tried to fire a shot at the federal officer. Gunfire ensued, and someone sitting in the window at the Anthony House was struck and killed by a stray bullet before order was restored. Baxter finally convinced White to go back to Pine Bluff. This shows his troops embarking at Pine Bluff. Go to Little Rock. And there's a drawing of the incident at the Anthony House. And this shows volunteers coming across the Arkansas River to support Brooks. So White went back to Pine Bluff. Interesting to know now that the African Americans are in both camps. They've been in both conventions, they're in both camps. Shortly after he returned to Pine Bluff, word reached White that another force of some 200 black Brooks supporters were organizing under the command of Captain J.M. Murphy at the community of New Gascony, about 16 miles below Pine Bluff, downriver. And on April 30th, White promptly embarked a command composed of white and black troops aboard the steamboat Halley and proceeded downriver. Their arrival caught Murphy by surprise, and the brief engagement that followed, White's forces routed the Brooks supporters, killing 7 and wounding 30. Congressman French Hill, who was here earlier, I think may have left, is an authority on this. He has family ties down there. And earlier this year, he took Paul Austin, Mark Christ, and me down and showed us around. And you need a guide because there are not any historical markers at New Gascony. But he showed us where, and I got a really good understanding of it. He's got an unpublished manuscript about this battle. In later years, White would serve in the state senate in 6 turbulent terms as mayor of Pine Bluff. But his greatest mark on Arkansas history was made during his brief involvement in the Brooks-Baxter War. Well, the Brooks forces also scored some victories. Shows Brooks troops in front of the State House. And you'll note about this picture, this clearly is an African American among those volunteering to fight for Brooks. So both sides are gathering people from both races, from both parties. Word reached the Baxter forces that Brooks was going to be resupplied with arms and ammunition from Fort Smith coming down the Arkansas River. And so they sent the steamboat Halley up the river to intercept it. The Brooks forces were alerted to the Halley's movements, and they lay in ambush where the river makes a bend near Palarm, near south of present-day Mayflower. And about 200 Brooks supporters concealed themselves and waited to intercept it. And when the Halley hove into view, they opened fire. The commander refused to surrender, and the captain of the boat was killed. One of the steam pipes was pierced, and the ship drifted downstream out of control. Half the Baxter supporters finally surrendered. The other half were either dead or wounded. Despite the growing tensions in the city, many local residents found the affair immensely entertaining. Bands played outside both the Brooks and Baxter headquarters, vendors hawked their wares, and the city's saloons did a roaring business. On April 21st, police arrested a drunken woman who appeared near the contested area wearing men's clothing, sporting a large revolver, and declaring that she wanted to join the army. I got that from Ken Barnes. I didn't find that myself. But the schism in the Republican ranks posed a real dilemma for Democrats, the conservatives. Some had supported Brooks' initiative as the best hope of unseating the hated regular Republicans. And they welcomed his coup d'etat. Others, including prominent Little Rock attorneys Augustus, Garland, and U.M. Rose, terrible picture of Garland, U.M. Rose, of Rose Law Firm fame, remembered Brooks' staunch radicalism and feared his ascension to the governor's chair. Garland, a former Whig and a Confederate senator, understood that the conservative/democratic element in the state could be a critical swing vote in the struggle, and that Baxter could be the instrument of the state's deliverance from Reconstruction. He and Baxter had become friends, and the embattled governor sought to bolster his position through Garland's standing in the community and his keen legal mind. But for Baxter, Garland is a weapon in the struggle. But for Garland, Baxter was only the means to an end. In a revealing letter to former Confederate Governor Harris Flanagan, Garland candidly admitted, quote, "It is a small moment, really, who is governor of these two. But it is a great moment to settle these troubles and get a government by and from the people." These sentiments were shared in Washington, D.C. by Robert Ward Johnson on the left and Albert Pike, who also supported Baxter's cause. In the final analysis, most Arkansans really didn't care, I think, about who occupied the governor's office. They just wanted some stability and order. And they joined the warring factions in appealing to President Grant. But Grant was hesitant to intervene. He had been pilloried, as in this cartoon in Leslie's illustrated newspaper, for his actions in Louisiana. And he did not want to get burned again by intervening in Arkansas. So he said essentially, you people settle it down there. Who's to settle it? Legislature or the courts? Baxter naturally favored the legislature, controlled by his faction. Brooks naturally favored the courts, which had in effect put him in office. They were ordered to call together a session of the legislature to settle the issue, but at first it was not possible to obtain a quorum, and then Brooks failed to agree, and finally Grant had to step in. He asked the Attorney General, okay, which one of these guys is the governor? And the Attorney General said, I think it's Baxter. I'm condensing quite a bit here. But Grant says, in effect, Baxter's the governor. Brooks, get out of the State House. Your forces disband. He cushioned it by making Brooks the postmaster in Little Rock, a job he held to his death, until his death. So Catterson and Fagan's militia, Catterson and Fagan met with Newton, and they agreed for a plan to get the troops out of the city and home as quickly as possible. And almost a month to the day after it began, the Brooks-Baxter War ended. I feel certain that most of you are no more edified than you were when I began. I must admit that it's still confusing to me as well. But the significance of what's the so what, I always ask myself, what's the so what of this? The so what of it is that the Brooks-Baxter War effectively brings Reconstruction in Arkansas to an end. This schism within the Republican Party opens the door to the restoration of democratic, conservative rule, and is going to bring an end to Reconstruction in Arkansas. And I'm going to let another speaker talk about what happens after that. But I'll be happy to take any questions you might have in the next 4 or 5 minutes. Yes, sir. Most accounts say about 200 people were killed, but a lot of those were accidents. Like the guy he was just sitting in the window and got shot. In the stray bullets that flew at the. It's amazing that only one person gets killed at the Anthony House because it's very congested. But some of them get wounded. But only about 200 people statewide. Probably the battle at New Gascony was the single most, and the attack on the Halley were the single most deadly encounters in the war. Yes, sir.
Other than what was going on here in the Little Rock area, what were some of the other, if you will, hot spots of violence in Arkansas?
I don't think there were any. That's the conclusion I get. It was mainly a Little Rock-centered event. And Ken, you've written about this, and I know Carl's written about it, and Mark's talked about it. But except for New Gascony in Jefferson County and the Halley incident right up I don't think it created too much of a stir outside of Little Rock. Is that your sense of it, Ken?
Yeah, they were sending their people to
Yeah,
Little Rock.
yeah. The people that were really fired up about it were coming to Little Rock to get engaged. It was a very volatile situation. It certainly could have turned out much worse than it did.
What's that first history that's written about?
John Harrell.
Yeah, who is he, and is the history any good? Or?
Yeah, it is a good hit. I mean, Harrell is a devoted lost causer, and he liked Baxter more than Brooks, I think. Was that fair, you say?
He was an editor of the Gazette.
Yeah.
So he was here on the scene and writing about it every day in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote this book like 25 years later.
1893,
Yeah,
something like
he's
that.
got chock full of details.
Yeah, he's got transcripts of some hearings that took place and newspaper accounts. It's great primary source history. His interpretation colors it.
Right.
But it's a lot of good stuff in that book.
Not
And
been used very much.
no, and it's hard to get a copy of now. Yes, sir.
How long did Brooks actually serve as governor?
About a month.
1 month?
Yes, sir. Came in on the 15th. That's court decision on the 15th. Grant's decision is rendered on the next 15th of the next month. And I think Baxter actually came back in and occupied the office on the 19th. So his tenure, such as it was, lasted about a month. Yes, ma'am.
What was the name of that
John M. Harrell, Harrell. And I think it's called the Brooks-Baxter War and something and the Reconstruction in Arkansas, isn't it, Ken? Something like that.
It's on microfilm.
Well, now you tell me, Blake. After I went to the dang Hendricks Library.
Yeah, I don't know how
tried-
easy to get, but Aaron Library loved it probably.
It's on microfilm. Okay.
Have you ever heard a story about Lady Baxter firing a weapon shot and it shattered the window?
Yes, they fired it at the end of this conflict after Baxter had been restored, and it apparently shattered windows in town, and somebody got injured. Is that right? There were a couple of guns fired, and one resulted in somebody getting fairly severely burned. But they say when they fired it, it shattered the windows in adjacent buildings. Yeah. It's a big gun. You just go out there and with a great history. Any other questions? Thank you very much.